Good morning, or evening for those who are joining us here from Asia. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It is a great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be another engaging discussion on a crucially important challenge facing the Indo-Pacific region. As many of you know, MLI has been placing a good deal of attention to the importance of the Indo-Pacific and its nexus with Canada's own foreign policy interests. Over the past year, we've hosted events and given a platform to key thought leaders across the region, highlighting the key stakes in the region and outlining the imperative for Canada to bolster its own engagement. This session will be focusing in particular on cybersecurity in the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to have a top cast of experts here from Australia, Japan, the United States, and Canada to shed light on these issues. Traditional security and the potential for conflict are evolving in marked ways during the cyber age. Security challenges are dynamic in this new era and not confined to the traditional domains of security, which have established forms of conflict avoidance and de-escalation, even if they don't always work. The takeaway is that there are some rules of the road and established practices in many spheres of traditional conflict. Yet, when it comes to cybersecurity, challenges and threats, the landscape is much more muddied, opaque, and potentially dangerous. States in the Indo-Pacific are amongst the leaders of this digital age, helping to lead the growth of technological developments in a range of areas, including next-generation networks like 5G and artificial intelligence. China especially has been spending hundreds of billions on developing its digital infrastructure and aggressively moving to export this technology to foreign countries in its periphery and globally. But these challenges are not just limited to China, as I believe our speakers will delve into later today, with challenges from other state actors such as Russia and North Korea, in addition to the rise of cyber criminals and terrorist groups that are not always state-directed. The malign use of cyber capabilities has been on display increasingly over the past few years. Several key elections, including ones in the United States and Taiwan, have demonstrated how certain actors are looking to disrupt and interfere with democratic processes. Misinformation and disinformation warfare, in addition to other cyber attacks, present a significant risk to a free and open Indo-Pacific and challenge the rules-based order beyond this region too. In this context, Canada lacks a well-considered and clearly articulated framework for addressing immediate security needs and planning for longer-term requirements. At issue is a cybersecurity gap that undermines Canadian safety, security, and prosperity. Simply put, Canada needs a coherent vision and a comprehensive policy for cybersecurity that actively and unapologetically deters aggression and defends our interests. But more importantly, this strategic planning needs to be done in concert with key allies. Both our traditional Five Eyes partners, such as the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, but also the Plus partners, such as Japan and other countries, key countries in Europe, such as Germany, France, and the Netherlands. On that note, I'd like to proceed to hand the virtual floor over to His Excellency Ambassador Kawamura Yasuhisa, Japan's ambassador to Canada, who has graciously agreed to provide some opening remarks for this panel discussion. Before coming to Canada, Ambassador Kawamura served as ambassador and deputy representative of Japan to the United Nations between 2017 and 2019. He has also served in a range of other senior roles in Japan's foreign ministry, including as press secretary, director general for press and public diplomacy, and he served in a range of overseas postings, including New York, Delhi, Indonesia, Brussels, and elsewhere. He continues to be a good friend and a strong proponent of strengthening Canada-Japan relations, both on the official track, but also through his robust and keen engagement with public policy institutes such as the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which we are eminently grateful. Japan clearly is one of the most important friends we have in the Indo-Pacific, and has been increasingly staking out a leadership position on buttressing and working collaboratively with like-minded partners to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. In this light, we are very much looking forward to hearing from the ambassador on some of his perspectives from Japan on this very important topic today. Ambassador, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Good morning and good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you, MLI, for inviting me to this very important webinar. And a webinar like this and working from home are examples of the new normal brought upon by COVID-19. The communication system plays a big role today and is anticipated to advance to be a social infrastructure. 5G, for example, is now being introduced internationally and is expected to provide various social services. While we live in a world where people increasingly depend upon information and communication technology infrastructure, we also come across news reporting the rapid increase in cyber crimes caused by the misuse of cyberspace and information and communication technology. Cybersecurity needs to be urgently ensured. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity also points out in its National Cyber Threat Assessment 2020 that the number of cyber threat actors is rising, and state-sponsored actors will almost certainly continue to conduct commercial espionage against businesses, academia, and governments to steal intellectual property and proprietary information. Webinar like today, which will be an opportunity to discuss the issue of cybersecurity with experts from different countries, are therefore very crucial, not only for Canada, but also for all of us. I'm going to talk about the actions taken by Japan for the realization of a free, fair, and safe cyberspace. There are three pillars. The first pillar is the promotion of rule of law. Actions taken in the cyberspace are often characterized as anonymous and borderless. These spaces require international coordination and cooperation, as well as rule-based international order in the cyberspace. Japan has joined the United Nations group of governmental experts in 2014 and has actively participated in the discussion to promote a rules-based cyberspace, for example, by promoting the discussion on the application of international law to cyberspace and the development of non-binding norms in cyberspace. Japan has also been an active member of the UN open-ended working group on cybersecurity and participated in the preparation of the consensus report on rules in cyberspace, which was adopted unanimously in March. In the G7, Japan has been actively involved in the discussion to promote a rule-based cyberspace. For example, as the Ise-Shima summit in 2016, which was Prime Minister Trudeau's first G7, the Ise-Shima G7 principle and actions on cyber was endorsed. It affirmed the openness, interoperability, reliability, and security of the internet would enhance the common values of the G7, such as freedom, democracy, and human rights. From the point of view of a free and open Indo-Pacific region, which aims to secure peace and prosperity of the region and the world through the realization of a rule-based order in the region, Japan is also increasing its cooperation on cybersecurity matters with the US, Australia, India, the UK, and other like-minded partners. The second pillar is the development of confidence-building measures. In order to avoid escalation of tensions in cyberspace caused by miscalculation and misunderstanding, it is important to deepen the understanding of each other's domestic laws, regulations, policies, strategies, and perceptions among governments. Japan has made an effort to develop confidence building by conducting cybersecurity dialogues with 14 nations and regions, including bilateral dialogues with the US, UK, France, Australia, and India, trilateral dialogues with China, the Republic of Korea, and the United States, as well as dialogues with ASEAN and the EU. The third pillar is cooperation and capacity building. In the borderless cyberspace, there's always a risk of cyber attacks via a country which does not have enough awareness and capacity to ensure cybersecurity, or so-called security hole. This security hole can be a risk factor for the entire world. In order to fill such security hole, Japan has been conducting capacity building and providing assistance for human resource development in various countries. For example, the ASEAN-Japan Cybersecurity Policy Meeting has been held annually since 2009. The ASEAN-Japan Cybersecurity Capacity Building Center was established in Thailand to provide technical assistance, including cyber exercises, joint awareness raising, capacity building, and mutual notification for incidents. Cyberspace and information and communication technology is changing daily. In order to build and maintain a free, fair, and safe cyberspace, the international community needs to keep making efforts. I have just talked about Japan's actions to show one example of such efforts. Well, I'm looking forward to listening to the discussion among experts from various countries today on the latest cyber risks, which the world is exposed to today, and how the international community needs to respond to them. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Many thanks, Ambassador, for those remarks, and I think it provides a perfect chapeau and introduction to this discussion, and helps us get into the panel on many of these issues. You touched on a lot of interesting things that I think some of our panelists will touch into a little bit more detail. But I really, in particular, was very impressed with some of the approach that you've mentioned, how Japan is looking not just multilaterally, but also bilaterally and minilaterally. So this issue needs to be dealt with in a range of different mediums. And also, I think that you referenced the importance of the different areas that Japan's focusing on, not just looking at this as a broad a rule of law issue, but also looking at building capacity in states in the region. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for those remarks. So I'd like to move forward and open our panel discussion. And as I said, we have great speakers here. In addition to having another speaker from Japan, we have speakers from Canada and Australia and the United States as well. And I think to kick off the discussion first, I'd like to welcome Richard Fadden, which I feel like is most people on this topic. He's not a stranger here, but I'll give a short introduction to Mr. Fadden before he has some short remarks. So Richard Fadden, of course, was Canada's National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2015 to 2016. And previously, he's had a range of senior roles in the Canadian Public Service, including as Deputy Minister of National Defence, Deputy Minister of Citizenship, Immigration Canada, and also as Director of CSIS. He currently holds a range of academic and think tank roles as well, including as a senior advisor here at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So, Mr. Fadden, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to participate in this webinar on a topic that is vital today, and I suspect is going to stay that way for a while. Let me start by saying that my remarks are going to be, to some degree, motivated by my experience both in foreign affairs and in national security, and I've tried to weld these together. And one of the conclusions that I've come to in the course of my work is that very few issues can be dealt with outside of context. There are some aspects of the cyber problem that can be, in fact, dealt with by experts of one sort or the other. But if we're going to talk about dealing with cyber threats writ large, either across the planet or in Indo-Pacific, we need to look at the context and look at some basic principle and some basic truth. So I'm going to start with some of those and then work my way through to something I think more relevant. So some basic thoughts, and forgive me for stating them, but I think sometimes it's important to do that. One, no country has a full grip on cybersecurity. And I would note that this has aspects, concerns, both in the public and the private sectors of those countries, and I'll come back to that. No country alone can attain full cybersecurity short of returning to the pre-digital age. Does not mean that nothing has been done either in Canada or in other countries, but in most cases it's incomplete and it's not comprehensive. Everybody is suffering from a security gap, and if we don't admit this from the very beginning, I think we're going to have a challenge. Why? Rapid rate of change, aggressive adversaries, the nature of the World Wide Web, of the internet, and the challenges of international cooperation. And that's where I'd like to start now in a little bit more of a focused way. Cyber threats of one sort or the other, they affect national security, they affect the sovereignty of states, and they affect the reputation of states. So I think we need to admit that, like all other national security challenges, you can't ignore these, but you also cannot expect that they will be dealt with like tourism. They are sensitive. Countries don't generally like to talk about these things. In the absence of a more basic, broad relationship, countries are not going to easily cooperate beyond a certain level. I'm generalizing on cybersecurity, absent a more general relationship, which encompasses political, economic, trade, tourism, and whatever kinds of other issues that we might want to mention, and ones that have been built up over the years. One of the things that I noted in particular when I dealt with national security issues when I was still working was it does take a while, no matter how well-intentioned people are, to develop a measure of trust so that countries start dealing in some respects with some of their secrets. And I think in the cyber area, in the cybersecurity area, there are some secrets. They're not entirely secrets. And I suspect that my Canadian colleague will talk about some of those quote secrets, unquote secrets that exist in the private sector. But I want to stress again that part of our challenge in this area of cooperating between the nations of the Indo-Pacific is to develop long-standing, or at least more in-depth relationships that will allow us to talk about a topic that's really quite sensitive for most countries, and we need to do this consciously. So let me turn to Canada. We're not a country that is inclined to great public policy statements, with marching bands and whatnot. That's not critical in and of itself if we articulate principles or if we have a framework. But in the case, for example, of national security policy in Canada or strategy, it dates from Prime Minister Martin's time, which in cyber years is ancient history. We need a new policy dealing not only with national security more broadly, but one with cyber in particular. We do have defined cyber objectives. They deal with the federal infrastructure, with a number of critical areas. We do collaborate within the Five Eyes, NATO, with a variety of other countries. But we have not even been able to develop a view to take a decision on whether or not we're going to allow Huawei, a Chinese company, from involving itself in the development of our 5G infrastructure. So while we're doing a whole variety of things, we don't seem to be able to galvanize ourselves as a country to develop a comprehensive approach in dealing with cyber issues. I think Canada has another challenge in dealing with the topic of today, which is how we might work together with the countries of the Indo-Pacific. And that is that we don't have that many substantive, effective, active strategic relationships in the area. We, of course, have Australia. In the case of Japan, out of deference to the ambassador who's talking to us, we do have a formal strategic relationship. Vice ministers meet, ministers talk every now and then. We have ship visits. But it's not one that's animated by a week-by-week or a day-by-day sense of commitment and collaboration. We need to put some meat on the bones. In particular, again, in dealing with a topic like cyber, which involves a fair bit of sensitivity. And it's relatively easy for people like ourselves to sort of say, well, just collaborate, public sector, private sector. But there's a strongly ingrained view in most governments in particular that you don't share too many of your own problems or too many of the potential solutions without some measure of a long-term relationship. And I think that's something that we need to do much, much more aggressively. Canada has very good diplomatic relations with most of the countries of the Indo-Pacific, but they are traditional in the sense that, that we sort of chug along on a file-by-file basis. We have periodic ministerial visits. They are not as intense as they can be, and we need to do that. Canada has the additional problem of balancing out its interest in the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe. And I think that's going to be a problem. It will be with us for a very long time. But I would argue that ignoring the Indo-Pacific, we will suffer the consequences of that. So let me just summarize by saying that, single countries are not going to deal effectively with the cyber challenge. We need to find a way to collaborate. That collaboration needs to be built on solid relationships, either within government or the private sector. And if we can't get governments to move as quickly as we can, there's no reason why the private sector, like companies, corporations, think tanks, universities, can't build relationships that might help. So let me stop there and simply say that, again, I think context in dealing with this issue is important in many respects. That doesn't preclude our dealing with particular sub-elements of the cyber issue. But unless countries find a way of deepening their relationships so that they can deal with sensitive national security issues more effectively than we sometimes can now, I'm not sure we're going to be able to push forward very effectively in dealing with the challenges of the Indo-Pacific on the cyber front. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dick. As always, I learn a lot from your insights, and two very important takeaways from that I took, anyways, is the idea that cybersecurity gaps and vulnerabilities, they're not unique to one country. There might be differences between different partners, but essentially all countries have these challenges and need to work together. But the second point, which I think is very important for today's discussion, and also sort of goes in line with some of the things I've been saying for a while about having to have a stronger strategy for the Indo-Pacific and also for specific partners in that region, is the sense that we shouldn't be looking at this issue, cybersecurity, in a fishbowl. So it shouldn't just be the idea that we need to improve cybersecurity on an ad hoc basis. It needs to be a part of a bigger package, which is a strategic relationship with some of these key countries in this region. Obviously, Japan being one of the important ones, but not exclusively to Japan. So I think that's a very important and instructive comment. I'd like to segue now and move back to our second Japanese colleague here. Dr. Tsuchiya Motohiro is a Dean and Professor of Faculty and Policy Management at Keio University in Japan. He is interested in the impact of information technologies on international affairs and is focused on cybersecurity. He's one of Japan's top cyber experts, often advises the government, and is very frequent on these discussions. So Tsuchiya Sensei, we're really happy that you could join us late there at night in Tokyo. And thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. So I really want to go back to Canada. So I visited many cities in Canada. So Vancouver, Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and I went to Edmonton to have as best Alberta beef. I really want to go back to Canada. But thank you again very much for giving me this opportunity. So Japan seems to have just passed the fourth peak of the COVID-19 infection. I hope Tokyo can host the Olympic and Paralympic Games next month. We are doing the best to secure the games in terms of COVID-19 and physical and cyber terrorism. In 2019, before the pandemic, Japan faced mega events such as new emperor's ceremony of accession, Rugby World Cup, and a G20 summit in Osaka. There were lots of cyber operation against these events, but there was no serious damage. Then we were preparing for Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. As you know, they were postponed by 1 year. As I said, we are in a very critical moment to decide we should host the Olympic Games or not. At this stage, we have to prepare for them. We have to do so in cyberspace too. And 2.5 years ago, it was in December 2018, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet approved National Defense Program Guidelines, NDPG we call it. It aimed to set a goal of the Japanese defense policy for next 10 years. I was involved in drafting it in Cabinet Office's Council. We discussed cross-domain warfare or multi-domain operations. So as you know, we are adding new domains to the existing ones, land, sea, air. The fourth operation domain is outer space, and the fifth is cyberspace. And the Japanese government added another one, electromagnetic space. So we have 6 domains. So future conflict might break out across these domains. So it might be more difficult to respond to such threats and risks. Japan was following a defense-only policy in cyberspace too before the NDPG, National Defense Program Guidelines, but it showed us a new idea. So during an emergency, if somebody attacks us on cyberspace, we might launch a counter-strike in cyberspace. It may be quite natural for Canada and other countries, but Japan was not engaged in such policy. We were just sticking to defense-only policy. But now, after the National Defense Program Guidelines, we can stop adversaries' use of cyberspace. It's quite new for us. We do not say what kind of measures we use to stop adversaries' use of cyberspace, but we say we do counter-strike. That is a first step for cyber deterrence for Japan. In the same year, 2018, several months ahead of the NDPG, the Japanese government published a cybersecurity strategy to prepare for Tokyo 2020. Now it is scheduled to be revised after the Olympic Games this year. National Center of Incident Readiness and Strategy for Cybersecurity, we call it NISC, NISC, has just proposed a tentative idea of the next cybersecurity strategy, which is to be finalized later this year. The core idea of the new strategy is cybersecurity for all. Of course, it should be for all, except bad guys. During the pandemic, the Japanese nation realized that we are lagged behind in terms of digital transformation, DX. For example, Tokyo Metropolitan Government is counting and releasing the number of COVID-19 cases every day. But we realized that they were collecting data by fax machines from lower municipalities. They collect fax papers and input numbers by hand. They miscounted many times. Anyway, we have many problems in IT system. Then the government says we have to seek DX and cybersecurity at the same time. They say so DX with cybersecurity. For national security side of cybersecurity, the draft idea of the next cybersecurity strategy says it will heighten the priority of cybersecurity in diplomacy and national security. Then we do make efforts first to promote rule of law, as Ambassador says. And second, to raise defense power, deterrence power, and situational awareness. And finally, to strengthen international cooperation and collaboration, as Mr. Faden says. For the international cooperation and collaboration, we further support capacity building among government, industry, and academia in the Indo-Pacific area, including ASEAN countries. As Ambassador said, Japan is a member of the 6th UN Cyber GGE group of governmental experts. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, the GGE just agreed on a report to be submitted to UN General Assembly in September. Japan made substantial contribution to the GGE efforts. Inside Japan, the government will establish a new agency for digital issues, digital transformation. I still don't know its official name in English, but here I say simply digital agency. It will focus on DX issues to make Japan more digitally friendly. The agency will work with cybersecurity strategy headquarters which is in charge of cybersecurity, and also with the National Security Council. So the digital agency and the headquarters trying to make the Japan more secure in cyberspace. So my time is running short. I do not go into the details, but we are ready to cooperate and collaborate with like-minded countries, including Canada. So some people say we might be able to join the so-called the Five Eyes countries. I'm not stick to the idea. Now we have the Quad framework among Japan, the US, Australia, and India. I want to strengthen and I want to expand the Quad framework with Canada, the UK, and other partners. So we say cybersecurity for all. It is not only inside Japan, but also with the international partners. Cybersecurity for all, except bad guys. I want to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tsuchiya-sensei. That's really interesting and informative, and I think it's again provides a nice sort of warm up to some of the discussion later on. One of the points I thought that was really interesting that you mentioned was how, from a diplomatic perspective, the upcoming cybersecurity strategy will have a significant focus. So not just looking at it again from a nation standpoint, but making sure that's an important part of Japan's diplomacy. And one thing perhaps we can get into later in the question period, but is also looking at this in a US-Japan alliance perspective. I know it was in 2019, I believe, that the US and Japan said that in certain situations, perhaps a cyber attack could be considered covered under the US-Japan Security Treaty, which seemed to be a pretty important development. So maybe not something else we can kind of tease out. And also your discussions on the Quad and the Five Eyes Plus idea, I think, is also very interesting and something perhaps in the moderated discussion we can talk a bit more on. So thank you very much. I'd like to move on to the next panelist, Ainiki Rikkonen. Ainiki, it's really great to have you back on MLI's platform. Ainiki is a research assistant for technology and national security program at the Center for New American Security in Washington. Her research focuses on emerging technologies, particularly AI and information systems. And in addition to kind of publishing in a range of prestigious outlets, Ainiki has formerly worked in the United States Department of Defense and other great positions. So Ainiki, it's great to have you on, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thank you to MLI for hosting today. If I could take a guess into the future, and I'm hoping it's a good one, I think that over time, the United States is going to take a much more expansive perspective on cyber threats and even what they are. I think that overall, it's going to become more challenging to look at threats to information security within the narrow frame of what we like to call hacking. And over time, countries will need to adapt to the diversification of ways that adversaries can steal information or disrupt network access. So there are two trends that I'd like to talk about today. The first one is the observable trend of malicious actors moving upstream and conducting cyber operations through supply chains. And what I mean by that is a software supply chain attack, which occurs when a threat actor compromises a third party that provides some kind of software services to the target. So prominent examples of this include the SolarWinds hack attributed to Russia, Microsoft Exchange in the similar time period, attributed to China. And then a couple of years ago, Operation Cloud Hopper, pretty notorious, was also attributed to China's government. And in that case, they used cloud service providers as a jumping off point to get to target companies. And so in these cases, a malicious actor can hack into one technology company and then get access to extremely many possible targets, even thousands potentially. And so some of the challenges here is that the traditional view of perimeter defense is evolving towards what we call zero trust architecture, as it seems to be that you can't even trust legitimate sources for software updates as much as one used to. What this also means is that a breach into one network, one company, or one organization could indicate a breach into another. It highlights the importance of disclosure requirements and information sharing. In the US recently, the Department of Homeland Security is issuing new reporting requirements for pipeline companies in particular. And so I think this will overall be a trend to watch going forward, having government institutions require that even private entities share what they know. The second trend that I would highlight is that there's supply chain risks outside of hacking. And in some cases, the adversary is actually becoming the supply chain, whether as a software provider or provider of network services more broadly. Globally, there's a demand for modernization and for digital services, whether that's 5G, space, online banking, smart cities, industrial technologies. And yet you have initiatives like the Digital Silk Road and the Belt and Road Space Information Corridor, which may increase, unfortunately, the reliance of some states on entities that are subject to the influence of China's government. And so this gets back to the debates we've heard here in Washington about, is it a backdoor? Is it a bug door? In some cases, those are both vulnerabilities, right? But there's a diverse set of ways to mitigate them. So there are some interesting opportunities for international cooperation. For instance, on 5G, some of the debates that have impacted the Five Eyes on the reliability of vendors like Huawei, these debates impact everyone else as well. So I would highlight some interesting news out of Ethiopia, for example. They're assessing 5G vendors at the moment, and they seem interested in a Vodafone-led group that might get funding from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. And so while this is not really in the traditional cyber bucket to think about using tools traditionally reserved for development to empower nations to secure their networks, I think it's a really critical area and will be a really interesting avenue for international cooperation. And so overall for cooperation, I think information sharing will continue to be really important, as will adapting to new means of cyber operations, new trends like these software supply chain attacks. And it will become increasingly important to prioritize finding solutions to information security threats that are outside of our traditional conception of hacking. Our adversaries are continuously innovating, and so should we as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anika. That's really interesting, and again, a lot there that we can tease out a bit more in the question period time. I thought one of the interesting points that you made was the importance of information sharing networks. And my thought process on this too is that if we think about the Five Eyes Plus as well, different members there, and even if we scope into the pluses more, we'll have different networks, different diplomatic partners, different strengths in those relationships that might allow us more access to broaden that network. As you said, a lot of these issues are not isolated to 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 countries, but it's a global issue, and I think we need to start thinking about it in that way. Very interesting. Thanks very much, Ainiki. I'd like to move on now to our next panelist, Bart Hogveen. And Bart is leading cyber capacity building efforts at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And for the last couple of years, he's been working on initiatives to strengthen regional frameworks for stability in cyberspace, in particular in areas of confidence building measures and the endorsement of norms of responsible behavior with a focus on Southeast Asia. So Bart, I think we've already had a bit of discussion about capacity building, but very excited to kind of hear your thoughts. And again, thanks for taking the late shift and joining us so late there in Australia. Bart, the floor is yours. Sorry, Bart, I think we're having a little bit of challenge with your audio. Okay, it sounds, oh. Do you want to try again just without the headphones, perhaps, Bart? Well, how about, Bart, we're just going to move on to Rafal, and then we'll come back to you, Bart.
Yep.
But we will look forward to your comments, but we're going to move on to Rafal, if that's okay, Rafal, or putting you up on the queue. And then we'll finish off with Bart. So our next panelist will be Rafal Rohozinski, again, who's I'm sure very well known to many people on this topic. Prolific writer, prolific author on these topics. He's the founder of the SecDev group, where he leads its geopolitical digital risk practice. Prior to founding SecDev, Rafal served as an advisor to the United Nations and to other organizations in more than 37 countries, and directed the Advanced Network Research Group at the University of Cambridge. Rafal, it's a real pleasure to have you on the program, and the floor is yours.
Real pleasure to be here as well. Thank you very much. Uh, in order not to violently agree with everything that's been said before, let me just step back a little bit before stepping forward to kind of really try to grasp at why we should be looking at cybersecurity from a strategic perspective, and why maybe it sort of sits outside of the bounds a little bit of ways that we've established global norms around other disruptive factors. I think the first thing to recognize is that the internet is 52 years old. In historical terms, this is really a blink of an eye, and yet in those 52 years, we've seen more than 2/3 of the world's population join into this infrastructure that has now underlaid most of our economic, political, and social events and relationships around the planet. It's also important to recognize that, speaking from the perspective of someone who's as old as the internet, if not a little bit older, that 2/3 of those who are now presently working and making the internet into this economic powerhouse driving development worldwide are under the age of 35, and more than 50% of those are under 25. And the vast majority of new users aren't coming from developed economies, but they're actually coming from developing economies or economies that are transitioning, such as those in Asia. This represents a huge demographic bubble of creativity that has largely been interacting with this resource unmediated by the kinds of institutions that have shaped, for the most part, people's relationships, both professionally, their concept of identity, their relationship to civic duty, and others. And we've seen the consequences of that in the last 2 decades, with the rise and the power of non-state actors, with the emergence of transnational terrorist groups that leverage recruitment from the internet, and with the mobilization of populations, sometimes towards genocide, such as we saw in Myanmar, propelled by the fact that this medium has made itself so available to others. The challenge with cyberspace is that this fundamental reordering of relationship between institutions and states are something that institutions have been very poor at being able to adapt at. And those are institutions at all levels. Those are institutions within countries. Those are also institutions at an international level. And the challenge of it, of course, is that at the moment, the world has been divided, in fact, into two sort of camps. Those that feel that the internet should remain open and largely unfettered by regulation, that is where, for the most part, the creativity and the economic value will come. And those countries that feel that a re-sovereignization of cyberspace, in other words, a reimposition of national rules, is really the way in which we can find the most stability, the most security as communities and as nations around the world. The absence of being able to find a consensus, or at least a workable consensus, has meant that the dark side of the internet, actors that are able to exploit jurisdictional hiding, sometimes the intentional support of nation states, or simply are able to operate across this largely borderless environment in the absence of states being able to leverage institutional-based means for being able to deal with them, has led to a problem of global cybercrime and criminality, which has proven very difficult to be able to deal with. It's also clear that cyberspace is a major strategic disruptor in the way that we see security framed through traditional national security lens, including the application of armed force. For those of you who have read Admiral Stavridis's latest book, 2034, the impact or the potential impact on cyber as a means of upending the kind of investment that countries such as NATO or groupings such as NATO have put into industrial warfighting is fairly significant and being taken remarkably seriously. It's also a dangerous time. As part of an engagement that I'm involved in, which is a trilateral 1.5 dialogue between China, Russia, and the US on the military uses of cyberspace, the Russian Federation has made the point that they see the strategic response to threats as being from cyber to nuclear and from nuclear to cyber, meaning that they don't necessarily differentiate between the two and see both as being part of the same level of response available to a state in order to deal with what they see as their national issues. But Asia is important in this calculus. Asia is where the new internet and the new rules of the internet will be built. With more than half the world's population, or 60% of the world population, and with what is predicted to be 40% of the smart city market by 2015, the sheer volume of humanity and technology that will require creative solutions using cyber is going to be significant. Invariably, within this mass of humanity, the new rules of the game will be written. And we've already seen that in part with China's Belt and Road Initiative, the export of smart city technology, smart city surveillance technologies, and a growing Russia-China alliance in terms of setting global norms over the re-sovereignization of cyberspace. In fact, we can almost say that the great game is on in terms of seeing which competing set of norms and rules will be the one that will happen for the future. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, for Canada, there should be a couple of key takeaways. And the first which is that cyber is not something that can be solved by the sheer force of a single nation state. It's going to require international cooperation. In fact, it's going to require a doubling down on the very kind of globalization that we've seen as threatening coming from the cyber domain. It means that Canada has to up its game. We need to start thinking like some of the countries that have recognized that interdependence is where true security can be found. We need to look at perhaps setting up institutions that will aggregate across the whole of government the ability to effectively communicate our interests across the social, political, and economic domain. Digital Canada is maybe not a concept that we should discard out of hand as an institution that would bring together capabilities that are currently scattered across several government departments. We need to start taking digital diplomacy seriously and appointing digital ambassadors in the way that Australia and Estonia has. And most of all, we need to start thinking a little bit outside of the box in terms of how we can come up with a global system of norms that addresses and bridges the gulf presently between the like-minded and the non-like-minded. As the ambassador has indicated in his talks, the GGE has just concluded its work, and the report, a consensual report this time, is due to be released in a few weeks. Hopefully, that'll give us a pathway towards this more consensual and interdependent future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rafal, and thanks especially for the recommendations. Those are always welcome. Very much enjoyed your comments, especially the idea that the need for more whole of government cooperation on this, and I assume that also in line with the private sector. And I very much like and agree with your suggestion on the need for a digital ambassador. I think that's a very smart discussion. Also, I think a really important point that you made, and the first time I've heard this, but I very much like this, the re-sovereignization when it comes to the internet and the digital sphere, and these challenges on regulations that we're dealing with, certain states favoring regulations, others not. It goes to the crux of the argument that we're having today. So thanks very much, Rafal. So I'm going to move now back to Bart to round off this panel, and then we're going to get into a moderated discussion. So Bart, the floor is now yours.
I hope you can hear me now. Great. Happy that technology works. Good morning to all of you in Canada, and good evening to those joining me from this side of the Pacific Ocean. And thanks, Jonathan and the team at MLI to give me the floor again, and thanks for the previous speakers for their excellent remarks and bringing up those views from Japan, US, Canada, and partly also from industry. I was asked to reflect on Australia's perspective on regional cybersecurity challenges, and in particular the Indo-Pacific. It seems Indo-Pacific is a bit of the new buzzword in town, including in Cybertown. Let me take you first to February 2019. That was when Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced a press briefing where he revealed that Australia's political parties, all three of them, suffered cyber attacks alongside the computer network of Parliament House by what he called a sophisticated state actor. But at the same time, he was not able, or not willing, to provide many details nor the name of that suspected state actor. But the communist opinion was quite undivided. It surely was Chinese state intelligence, the sophisticated attack that used a suite of new malware and techniques not yet detectable by malware detection companies. Those skills are only possessed by a few countries. And just to name them, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Israel, China, and the US. But really only one state would have the motive, the capability, and the extensive track record to conduct such an operation in Australia against an institution of critical national importance. At least that was the dominant argument then, and it still is today. Later in June 2019, again, a highly professional group gained access to student and staff data from the Australian National University, one of the country's premier universities where many prime ministers and political leaders did their studies, and also a key institution for science and technology research. And finally, in June 2020, the Prime Minister again warned the nation of what he called an ongoing campaign of cyber attacks targeting all levels of government, essential services, and businesses. Again, no culprit was mentioned, but he cautioned everyone to be alert and to shore up defenses. Now, Australia is sometimes referred to as the lucky country, although not always for the best of reasons. But really on the cyber front, I would argue that Australia has been quite lucky indeed. While much more is happening to businesses on the continent, I think as the previous speaker alluded to, the number of cyber incidents of a national security and state-sponsored nature can really be counted on the fingers of one hand. And in fact, so far, Australia has not really experienced major cyber havoc, as other countries have, even quite recently, what we've seen in the US, for instance. And that is causing some complacency. Generally speaking, we could say that cybersecurity practices in government, amongst businesses, and in society are far from perfect, or even meeting the standards of a mature digital economy. And it seems like that a lived experience of a real incident seems to be quite critical, given that the digital domain is so intangible, in particular for policymakers and political leaders, but also I think as a previous speaker alluded to, it's so kept kept in secretive and intelligence circles. Now, moving to strategy and policy, as some of you may have seen, Australia issued a new national cybersecurity strategy just last year in August. But when I say national strategy, I should probably say an Australian government strategy. Or if I want to be really critical, I should say a strategy by the Departments of Home Affairs and Defence. And that's really kind of a first point of critique, that it's not a truly national strategy despite efforts, best efforts, to include industry and other third parties' views. And I think that was also the comment made by Jonathan earlier. In fact, Australia's national cybersecurity strategy at the moment goes hand in hand with the Defence Strategic Update, which was launched just a month earlier. And that strategy explicitly declares Australia's ability and willingness to protect military power and deter actions against us. And really centers around the ideas of the need to be self-reliant and ready for high-intensity operations as well as grey zone conflict. And that's a quote from the strategy. But really, the common thread in both strategies is quite clear, and I think that's also probably the elephant in the room when talking about cybersecurity in the Indo-Pacific. It's aimed at protecting Australia from a growing perceived threat from China, and if not a threat, then at least a defense against a CCP that is increasingly assertive, if not aggressive, in its behavior towards other countries in the Indo-Pacific and also towards Australia, including in the digital domain and predominantly in the digital domain. And added to that is, of course, the risk of a deepening China-US competition in the technology area, or even the risk of a technological decoupling. And Australia's answer in all of this has been, let's shore up our national defense and further improve our defense agencies' response capabilities. And on cybersecurity, both the Defence Strategic Update and the National Cybersecurity Strategy contained two major investments. One was a $50 billion investment in cyber and information warfare capabilities, spread over 10 years, but still a substantial investment. And $1.6 billion, again over 10 years, for the Australian Signals Directorate. And that's kind of where the cybersecurity function within the Australian government sits. And I think that's typical for Five Eyes countries, that kind of the cybersecurity role is so closely linked to the intelligence and the signals intelligence role. But this is definitely not the case in many countries, let's say in our neighborhood, and definitely not in our immediate neighborhood when we look at Southeast Asia or even the Pacific. This issue about militarization of cyberspace and the cybersecurity function is something that's been brought up quite often in conversations with partners, in particular with ASEAN partners. But this is very much internally and domestically focused. When we look at the external affairs side, the tone is, I would say, markedly different, even by the Prime Minister. And let me quote him. During the Defense Strategic Update, he said, "It's not just China and the United States that will determine whether our region, the Indo-Pacific, stays on path for free and open trade, investment and cooperation that has underpinned stability and prosperity, the people-to-people relationships that bind our region together. Japan, India, the Republic of Korea, the countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and the Pacific," surprisingly doesn't mention Canada, "all have agency, choices to make, parts to play, and of course, so does Australia." End of quote. So when we read the tone of Australia's new international engagement strategy for cyber and critical technology, just launched last month, we hear a far more balanced Australia, and an Australia that's moving beyond cyber and increasingly starts to include considerations of the use and adoption of technologies and the state's use of new technologies. And in the international strategy, you will read and hear that there is the recognition that there is a competition between major powers, i.e. US and China, and even the risk of that decoupling. Yes, there is the adoption of a tech-enabled gray zone activities into statecraft. And there are concerns about practices of invasive surveillance, influence, disinformation campaigns, foreign interference, etc., etc. But there is also the other angle, which is technology and cyber-enabled technologies that provide increased economic productivity, that allow us to have effective responses to humanitarian crisis. And it's also a driver of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think one of the previous speakers even had a pin of the SDGs on his jacket, and that's particularly relevant in our case for our neighbors in the South Pacific. And in that sense, here are a few thoughts, let's say, based on Australia's international engagement with the Indo-Pacific and with Indo-Pacific-based partners for the further discussion. And I would like to introduce initially 4 domains, but I added a 5th one. One is where we see a deepening and increasing level of operational partnerships, in our case of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre or the Signals Intelligence Service, with regional counterparts. There is a partnership with incident response teams in the South Pacific. There's Asia Pacific CERT with a key role also for Japan, and bilateral channels, increasingly bilateral channels with Indonesia, with Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, India, etc. So that's really at the operational cybersecurity level of kind of the incident responders and the cybersecurity centers. Then on top of that, there is a regional approach, which is very much focused on ASEAN, and I think it was mentioned already a few times, and the ASEAN Regional Forum. And I think there we really have to credit our colleagues from Japan for their leadership role, mentioned previously, on keep the discussion going on confidence building measures. And I think one point I would like to make, I think in the introduction it was mentioned that there might be an issue with looking at cybersecurity issues through the prism of conventional ways of dealing with regional security issues. I think we really see that cyber and ICT and technology issues are being brought into the conventional and regular ways of dealing with regional security issues. And that is in fact an accepted and constructive way to deal with what still is a very new topic for many countries in the region. The one point I added in this, and to be honest, I'm not sure, let's say, to what extent Canada played a role in this, but Australia has been quite active in international attribution efforts after a few major incidents, in particular that have been attributed to the Russian Federation, where they build an international coalition around a public attribution. And I think we see that more and more, that countries tend to build international coalitions when they want to provide a deterrent effect, partly through attribution. Previously mentioned was already the Quad, which is an increasingly important factor for Australia, so the partnership with India, the US, and Japan as the liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, I just have to highlight as well the work of the GG, and I think there is despite criticism that may be about, let's say, a lack of a Canadian strategy, the Canadian delegation has played a really key role in the UN open-ended working group that wrapped up earlier this year. And Japan, again, played a massively important role in the conclusion of the other UN cyber group that concluded last week. So I think all in all, and I think there are different pockets of areas where international collaboration is picking up. And I think Australia, with partners in the Indo-Pacific, is trying to play an active and a constructive role in all of that. And the more we'll join that effort, the better. Thank you.
Many thanks, Bart. Yeah, a lot in there and a lot of really good points. I do hope that maybe in the next couple of years, the more events we do such as this and the more attention Canada pays to this, maybe we'll be included in Australia's list of key partners there in the Indo-Pacific. We're surely hoping and pushing for that. Some really excellent points, though, and I think we can learn a lot from the examples of the specific threats that Australia faces. And also, I very much enjoyed your discussion on capacity building, because I think that's really crucial when we're talking about this region, is not just what the Five Eyes and the Five Eyes Plus are doing on cyber, but what's happening in ASEAN, South Asia, and beyond. So very great points. I'd like to move on now to the moderated discussion. And I'll try to be brief. I do plan on abusing the position of the moderator a little bit to ask a few questions, but I know the audience has been very interested in this discussion today as well, and they've posed a number of interesting questions. So let me kick off by sort of truncating a couple questions into one. And I think this touches on things that all of the panelists mentioned today. But I want to focus this a bit on the number one, the threats, and number two, the vulnerabilities that states are facing in the cyber realm. And I want you to think about this, very quickly. So, if everyone can kind of give me about a 60 to 90 second answer on this. But I want to hear what your thoughts are on the top one or two or three threats in cyber terms right now in this region. And also, what are the main vulnerabilities? In very clear language, what do you think those are? And also, more importantly, where do you see that going? So we know where the threats and vulnerabilities are right now. But if I can ask you from a 10 to 15 year horizon, if you were to wake up in 15 years, hopefully we're not still talking about COVID-19, but what do you foresee as the main threats and vulnerabilities that may not be addressed in that period? So if I can start off with Rafal on that question.
Well, I think I'd summarize this in a kind of a trite way, and it's not unique to the region. Look, the internet was built for resilience. It was not built for security. We fundamentally have built a foundation or a whole edifice of dependencies in economic and in social terms, as well as in sort of management of humanity in cities terms, on a technology that cannot be secured. So really, the only way of being able to secure it, in absence of being able to reinvent it technically, is to find international consensus. And this is where the hard part is going to come in. I mean, look, China, Russia, if you like, the non-like-minded, have a particularly strong vision on how they see this technology evolving and the kinds of social and political controls that need to be put on it. Now, the like-minded see this as being antithetical to the kind of rule of law, democratic principles that we see this technology somehow enhancing and being imbued in. The reality is we need a breakthrough moment. That doesn't mean that we need to put the internet under global government or reinvent the ITU to provide that kind of framework. But it does mean we need to start thinking creatively on how we accommodate this re-sovereignization of space so that there is a shared interest around protecting it. Maybe a good model might be something like ICAO, which is one of the quiet UN agencies that allows air traffic and other global infrastructure to operate with a minimum of friction. Of course, Belarus being set aside for a moment. But definitely, I think this question of how do we move towards an institutional framework that accommodates re-sovereignization while at the same time preserving the basic interoperability of the internet, recognizing its fundamental insecurity and enduring insecurity, that's the question that we're going to have to find consensus of in the next 10 to 15 years.
Thanks so much, Rafael. That's great. Ainiki, do you have thoughts on this?
I do. Supply chain threats and supply chain vulnerabilities. No, but in all seriousness, I would say supply chains is one area and standards is the other. Thinking about supply chains, who owns the digital backbone? Who's providing your networks, your applications, your services, even things in the App Store may have their own backdoors, depending on who's collecting the data. And I think it plays into this notion of the gray zone that's been mentioned. It's not just hackers out there, hackers versus defenders, but also legitimate organizations in play that have their own interests or susceptible to certain influences. The other one, standards, as Rafael mentioned, the internet's 52 or so, but it's not going to always look the way that it does. Huawei and certain Chinese government entities put forward a proposal for new IP, looking at what new standards might look like that theoretically might give a little bit more control to governments, for better or worse, probably worse. And so I think it'll take looking at things pretty holistically, looking at things long-term, not just in terms of, what are the bugs in our systems, but systemically what might evolve in the future and really how can we get ahead of the curve.
Thanks very much, Ainiki. You guys are great. You're already answering my third question, so this is making it very easy. And I'm going to segue to Dick now, and a couple of the points that Rafael and Ainiki made there in international cooperation. I think of bodies like the G7 and others that have so much on their plate, so many different issues that they're tackling. I recently read the G7 Foreign Ministers communique, and it's like a Bible of all the challenges in the world. I would agree that this would be a logical space for the G7 to start putting some more attention to. But on the international cooperation side, how much traction do you think we'll be able to move on this? In addition to sort of the original question on threats and vulnerabilities. Dick, happy for your thoughts.
Thanks. Well, on threats and vulnerabilities to start, I think the thing that worries me the most is the possible impact of all these threats on emerging democracies in the Indo-Pacific. Not every country in that area is a settled democracy with a long tradition. Some are, some aren't. And I think the issue of misinformation, malinformation playing on democracy is really, really important. I think the other area that one of my co-panelists mentioned that I think we need to worry about more and more is non-state actors mucking about in this area. And I think the growth of criminal activity is significantly being underplayed today, generally speaking. And it's one area where I do think it's easier to promote international cooperation, because in the case of criminal activity, there's usually a criminal statute, there are procedures, and there are police that can deal with it. And I think that's one area where we should, build a banner and start making a bit of a fuss about it. I may be the Darth Vader to this conversation, but in terms of 15 years from now, I can see, going to Rafael's concerns about some of the concerns that he's dealt with, I can see the world developing into a bit of two spheres dealing with the World Wide Web, with the internet and all of this stuff. I really do hope we can find a way to find a consensus on the rules that will allow the free and open use of the internet, but I'm not so sure we're going to succeed, at least not in the short term. So I think part of the issue is we may have to deal not only in the area of cyber, but in other areas with spheres of the willing outside of existing organizations. I don't think the G7 is the right forum to deal with this. They have too much on their list right now. And I don't think that's the right grouping. The G10 or the G20 rather has not really proven it to be very effective. So I would argue 3 or 4 countries, possibly those that are being represented here, should sit down, come up with a list of 20 countries or something, and try and do something in a new coalition of the willing. I don't think, with great respect to Rafal, that a United Nations specialized agency model is going to work here. I wish he were right, but I don't think he is. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dick. Tsuchiya Sensei, your thoughts?
Thank you very much. So in terms of cybersecurity, so people tend to talk about software side, but I want to focus on the physical side. Japan is an island country, so we are dependent on submarine cables, undersea cables. So our international traffic, 99% of the international traffic goes through submarine cables. If you look at the submarine cable market, there are three big companies: Japanese NEC, American Subcom, and European ASN, so Alcatel Submarine Networks. So these three companies are occupying 90%, more than 90%. But a Chinese company is trying to penetrate into the market. For example, we are talking about East Micronesian cable. So the Chinese company's bid was 20% lower than other three companies. So we are doubting the Chinese government's subsidy to the project. So Nikki talked about the supply chain. This is also another supply chain risk. So we have cables and we have some dry part on the land. So we need several machines and computers to connect these cables, and we have to be prepared for the future attacks on those cables and those machines connected to the cables. So we have to think about it. Australia is also an island country. So Australia is also dependent on undersea cables. So we have to think about how we connect. So we are now connected to Canada, Trans-Pacific cable. And so we are dependent on those cables, how we can trust these cables systems. So that should be the threats for me for the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A very important point on submarine cables. I think that's something that's often neglected, but a very significant issue that you brought up there, Tsuchiya Sensei. Bart, the last 60 seconds is yours for this round.
Yeah, great. Maybe I want to, in answer to your question, and I think it's partly related to the comment that Mr. Fadden made earlier, is I think we still do not fully understand the nature of the cybersecurity threats and incidents that we see happening. And I think if we do an analysis, lots of focus is kind of on the state-based or the state-sponsored attacks or incidents or infiltrations, but the far majority is of criminal nature. And I think we see more and more attention going into kind of the cyber crime and the organized crime area, but which is still very much, from a policy angle, very much an unexplored area. And I do agree that I see greater chances of international cooperation in that field rather than in the international peace and security field. The other thing, when talking about international collaboration, there's a bit of an irony, I think, in all of the initiatives that we talked about. And I think we as the West have a bit of fighting a bit of an uphill battle here. If you, for instance, look at how we have perceived cybersecurity, we always try to stick to kind of ICT security, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and information. Whereas the Chinese and Russian narrative was, let's say, a much more comprehensive concept of information security. And I think we're still trying to stick to those kind of different perspectives, but in reality, we see that even our own countries are moving more into this information space when talking about cybersecurity issues. The same for some of the UN initiatives that were just mentioned. They started off as initiatives by the Russians, and then a couple of years later, they are being perceived as American initiatives, talking about a group of governmental experts. And I think we're seeing probably the same tendency with kind of the Western countries or the fighting back against suggestions for a legal instrument to deal with cybersecurity, an international legal instrument. Whereas we see more and more from different sides calls to do come up with something which is binding, a binding instrument for state affairs to be guided by.
Thanks very much, Bart. I'm just going to move back quickly to Rafael, who had a quick point that he wanted to make, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Sure. No, I just want to go back to something that Dick said about the emergence of spheres of influence, and I think this is a really important point that we need to consider. Look, underlying this, the sort of disruptive aspect of cyberspace is this strategic competition, and one of the ways that the strategic competition in cyberspace is being played out is through what's known as the vulnerabilities equities process, which basically means that countries stockpile vulnerabilities as part of a hedge that these will become useful tools for interstate or for resolving interstate issues. The challenge of that, of course, is that by having this kind of an arms race occurring, it runs completely opposite to a need for creating predictability among countries that really is the root basis of cooperation. So I think, my point here, just to go to Dick's, is not that I advocate for a UN agency to somehow take over the regulation of cyberspace, because I think, as he does, that's not likely to happen. But in the interests of keeping your friends close but your enemies closer, finding some kind of a mechanism through which you can have active discussions and where you can find a minimum threshold of security that is acceptable to all, that at least takes this hidden process of stockpiling vulnerabilities and makes it more of an overt process, as we've had with other arms controls regimes, probably is worthwhile, as opposed to simply not having that process and living with a gross strategic insecurity indefinitely.
Thanks a lot, Rafael, for that point. It's a good point, and again, a good natural segue to my next point, because I think it's I think I was paraphrasing you. It's a necessary but maybe not sufficient way to framework to approach some of these issues. And I think I'd like to move on now actually to the audience questions, because some of the other points that I've been thinking about are very close to what the audience has been interested in. And getting back to this point of frameworks to deal with some of these challenges going forward, we talked obviously from a large scale, multilateral scale of the United Nations. But we mentioned, and several of you have mentioned during your remarks, the Five Eyes. I think the quadrilateral dialogue has also come up. From a Canadian perspective, number one, would these sort of frameworks make sense for us, in addition to working in the multilateral sphere and other forums? Would the Five Eyes construct and also potentially the Quad make sense for us to be pursuing this area? And another sort of related question to this, we have one of the audience members referenced. We unfortunately don't have a member from New Zealand today. That wasn't intentional. We also don't have someone from the UK, so there's no rhyme or reason why they haven't been included. But I think one of our audience members has been asking about New Zealand in particular, in its future in the Five Eyes, and particularly its relationship with China. So I wonder if we can kind of dovetail some of these points together and look at this issue of the Five Eyes, whether this is an area that makes sense going forward on this particular issue, whether the Five Eyes Plus idea holds any merit. And maybe if I can start off with Dick on this, because he's had so much experience as a practitioner in this field, what your thoughts are on the Five Eyes taking a leading role in this, or whether that's just one small part of the puzzle.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think it's one small part of the puzzle. I think we have to remember that the Five Eyes are an intelligence alliance. It has been expanding in other areas. You deal with immigration and whatnot. But it is an alliance where there is that kind of trust and long-standing relationship that I talked about in my initial comments. And I think we should continue to work within the Five Eyes. Having said this, there's a real concern within the Five Eyes. I was on another webinar not too long ago about letting this intelligence alliance become a jack of all trades. So my solution is you take the Five Eyes and you add 5 or 6 countries, much like the G7 became the G10 or the G20, and you build that coalition I was talking about. Don't ignore the Five Eyes, but most of what it does is done in secret. And I do agree with others who articulated the view we have to stop being so secretive about a lot of the things that we do in this area. I think it'd be great if Canada was invited to join the Quad. If we do accept to join the Quad, given an invitation, it actually means the allocation of resources and intellectual capacity to be a real partner. And I go back to the issue I was raising earlier. We still have the challenge in Canada of balancing off the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, with Europe and Russia and all the problems there. And fundamentally, to state the obvious, we're still next door to the United States. So the issue protecting, dealing with North America as an entity is also very important. Having said all of this, I do agree entirely with Rafael. If you can get a dialogue going, if you can build even a partial consensus on any of these issues, go for it. Thank you.
Excellent. Bart, can I have your thoughts on there from Australia on the feasibility of the Quad being an area to really work on this, or also as Australia being a member of the Five Eyes, what its potential role could be, or if you have any other bright ideas in addition to those that we mentioned on areas to address this.
Yeah, maybe to touch on that point that was raised about New Zealand, and I think that I think the reality of it aligns pretty much with what Dick just mentioned, is that the position of the New Zealanders was the Five Eyes is very much an intelligence sharing alliance and shouldn't, let's say, go into all different kinds of directions. So I think there is less light, let's say, between the Five Eyes partners than has been reported in some media outlets. That said, I think all of the Five Eyes partners, and New Zealand being one of them, and Australia being one of them, are still trying to grapple with the changing geopolitical reality in the Indo-Pacific. I think what we see from an Australian perspective is that there are various forums where strategic security issues are being discussed and being fleshed out, and cooperative measures are being initiated and discussed. The Five Eyes being one, sits front and center, I think, in our relations with what I would call kind of the first class military and cyber nations. But in addition to that, the Quad has become very important in Australia's discourse in the region, but also ASEAN and the ASEAN Regional Forum, the recent partnership on artificial intelligence. You see kind of all these different kind of, call it, networks and regimes of international collaboration being established and partly expanding, and I think it will develop in some kind of overlaying network of networks, but then in terms of international diplomacy and international affairs.
Excellent, thanks, Bart. Ainiki.
Firstly, I wanted to agree with the point that, I think this is an area where we can't be too secretive. And part of this is because the private sector is so involved as well. I think it's hard to do cyber defense when so much of the information you need and so many of the targets of cyber operations include the private sector. So that would be my bid for coming out of the shadows a bit. In terms of particular groupings, I really like this concept of the D10 or the T12 or the Tech 10, however many numbers it settles on, because, it's not just about intelligence operations. It's also looking at, development tools, looking at how do you proliferate standards for assessing risk, whether that's political risk, technical risks, or financial risks. And I think, given the interconnectedness, it doesn't make sense to keep all of these things pooled within a small group of countries because really, vulnerabilities scale worldwide. So I think it's better to be more open than not.
Thanks, Annika. That's a really good point. I think that kind of hinges well off a point Dick made earlier on the G7 and other organizations that may not be the appropriate bodies for this. And I think we need to get a bit more creative and something that's actually focused on this particular issue itself, rather than relying on pre-existing bodies. So excellent point. So Chia-sensei, do you have some thoughts on this?
Thank you. So after Second World War, Japan lost most of the intelligence capabilities. So some people say now we want to join the Five Eyes, but I'm skeptical because people say so we can share information, share intelligence with other partners, but information sharing in intelligence activities means information exchange. If we don't have enough information, enough data, enough intelligence to exchange, we will not be able to receive good intelligence from you and other partners. So why we don't have such capabilities? Because the Article 21 of the Japanese Constitution says we have to respect people's secrecy of communications. That's why we don't have powerful signal intelligence agencies in Japan. We don't have Japanese version of NSA. So we say, so we are dependent on the NSA, US government under the Japan-US Security Treaty. but we have to raise our capabilities in intelligence and cybersecurity. So without it, we would not be a good partner even in Five Eyes or other intelligence arrangements. So we have to raise our capabilities first. Then we want to have a better relationship with other partners. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Sensei. Rafal, you have the last word.
Sure. Well, during my opening remarks, I made the point that we need to look at the internet and these technologies as a generic infrastructure, and that's what it is. And as a generic infrastructure, it's something that really cannot be segmented between one group of countries or another group of countries, because ultimately what we share is so much more than what separates us. That creates a bit of a conundrum, because this idea of a D10 or clusters of countries that share interests only works as much as those countries can insulate and defend what values they have from the rest. And that's clearly something that has proven impractical, both because of this strategic calculus that I talked before, as well as the gray zone that exists in cyberspace. So we have to get used to the fact that cyber in of itself is a little bit like biosecurity. It's a bit of an all or nothing game. And in that all or nothing game, that international consensus, the elusive international consensus, is really critical. Now, the critique I would make for the like-minded is that for the last 15 years, our position, and this is really the position of both the Five Eyes, the G7, if you like, the democratic countries, has been, don't change anything. The internet has to stay the same, which of course is not really rung true for countries that have been caught up in the way that the internet has changed drastically social relationships. Look at places like Myanmar, look at any country where all of a sudden politics has been upended because of a young generation coming online. In all of these countries, rule setting has become a priority. Now, when automobiles were first introduced into the roadways of the United Kingdom in early part of the last century, guess who was responsible for making the rules? The Automobile Association, because at that time it was seen that only drivers had the means of being able to determine what rules work best. Well, our concept of internet governance is kind of stuck in that era. And I think that until the like-minded are able to recognize that the rules that will apply to everyone have to be the rules that will be accepted by everyone, and to change our dialogue and change our narrative from defend the past to look at the future, we run the risk of both spheres in the way that Dick has outlined them, as well as a unhealthy competition and insecurity that will persist.
Thanks very much, Rafal. It's a great ending point. I mean, the audience has had a number of really interesting questions here, in addition to me having countless questions that I haven't been able to ask. But unfortunately, like every event, they do have to end at some point. I think that we have a good basis here to continue this discussion for a future webinar. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody here on the panel for joining, and of course the audience members for their great questions. There's been a lot of interesting takeaways. We'll have a report that comes out afterwards on this, in addition to having this webinar live on YouTube as well. But one point I just wanted to close on, and I thought this was interesting, that several of you made during the course of this webinar, was one, the importance not to look at cyber issues in isolation. So I think Dick made this point at the beginning, but I think others made this as well with the interconnectedness. From a Canadian perspective, it strikes me that we need to be thinking on a couple wavelengths. Number one, obviously, we need to be beefing up our game strategically on cybersecurity issues. But number two, we need to be doing that same thing when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region. We need one in isolation will not work, will not be sufficient. So we need a clear, a robust growing of our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and that in tandem will help some of the direction that we have on cybersecurity with some of these key partners in this region. So it's not going to be sufficient just to draft a cybersecurity strategy and assume that some of our partners in this region will immediately become our closest partners on this. I think we, hand in hand, have to build those relationships up. So again, a very interesting discussion from my perspective, and I thank you all for joining, and of course, thank you to the audience. Thanks very much.
Bye all. Thank you.